Hello everyone, this is Miss Q, and today we are going to be looking at Module 19, Lesson 3, Reconstruction in the South. As we read this particular chapter, I want you to focus in on the following questions. Ask yourself these questions. Who were some prominent African American leaders during the Reconstruction? And why was the election of Hiram Revels significant? Also, ask yourself, what do you think was the most important change made by Reconstruction state governments? Explain your answer. Also think about, for what reasons did some local governments not stop the Ku Klux Klan? Ask yourself, how did the Ku Klux Klan's use of terror interfere with elections in the South? What was the Compromise of 1877? How did Plessy versus Ferguson affect life in the United States? We will talk about that in a second. And what was the relationship between Jim Crow laws and segregation? As we read, think about some of those things. So, Reconstruction in the South. If you were there, you live on a farm in the South in the 1870s. Times are hard because you do not own your farm. Instead, you and your family work in a landowner's cotton fields. You never seem to earn enough to buy land of your own. Some of your neighbors have decided to give up farming and move into the city. Others are going to work in the textile mills. But you have always been a farmer. Will you decide to change your way of life? Reconstruction, governments. After Grant became president in 1869, the Republicans seemed stronger than ever. They controlled most Southern governments, partly because of the support of African American voters. However, most of the Republican office holders were unpopular with the white Southerners. Carpetbaggers and scallywags. Some of these office holders were northern-born Republicans who had moved to the South after the war. Many white Southerners called them carpetbaggers. Supposedly, they had rushed there carrying all their possessions in bags made from carpeting. Many Southerners resented these Northerners, accusing them, often unfairly, of trying to profit from Reconstruction, because the South needed both physical and economic rebuilding. There were many business opportunities. Northerners who had not been devastated by the war had more money to invest and could therefore profit from these opportunities. Southern Democrats cared even less for white Southern Republicans. They referred to them as scallywags or greedy rascals. Democrats believed that these Southerners who had betrayed the South by voting for the Republican Party. Many Southern Republicans were small farmers who had supported the Union during the war. Others, like Mississippi Governor James Alcorn, were former members of the Whig Party. They preferred to become Republicans rather than join the Democrats. African American leaders. African Americans were the largest group of Southern Republican voters. During Reconstruction, more than 600 African Americans won election to state legislatures. Some 16 of these politicians were elected to Congress. Other African Americans held local offices in counties throughout the South. African American politicians came from many backgrounds. Hiram Revels was born free to North Carolina and went to college in Illinois. He became a Methodist minister and served as a chaplain in the Union Army. In 1870, Revels became the first African American in the U.S. Senate. He took over the seat previously held by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Revels had a moderate view of the readmission of former Confederates. Education and employment for African Americans were two of his top priorities. Revels exemplified the ability of African Americans to take part in governing. After completing his term, he became the first president of Alcorn University. Unlike Revels, Blanche K. Bruce grew up in slavery in Virginia. Bruce became an important Republican in Mississippi and served one term as a U.S. Senator. He worked to integrate the military while in office. So this is a picture of clergyman and educator Hiram Revels. He was the first African American elected to the U.S. Senate in 1870. State governments changed direction. The new Reconstruction state governments made policies that increased civil and voting rights for African Americans. They passed laws that ensured African Americans were allowed to vote in every community. In many places, however, there was still resistance by whites because former Confederates usually could not vote. They struggled to maintain political influence. Reconstruction governments provided money for many new programs and organizations in the South. They helped to establish some of the first state-funded public school systems in the South. They also built new hospitals, prisons, and orphanages, and passed laws prohibiting discrimination against African Americans. Many of these programs improved the lives of African Americans and whites in the South and gave people economic opportunities and access to political offices. However, racism and the dramatically different culture of groups led to conflicting expectations, and sometimes tensions led to violence. Southern states under Republican control spent large amounts of money. They aided the construction of railroads, bridges, and public buildings. These improvements were intended to help the Southern economy recover from the war. To get the money for these projects, the Reconstruction government raised taxes and issued bonds. Although some people protested the increased taxes, the improved infrastructure helped the South to increase its trade and production capabilities. The Ku Klux Klan. As more African Americans took office, resistance to Reconstruction increased among white Southerners. Democrats claimed that the Reconstruction government were corrupt, illegal, and unjust. They also disliked having federal soldiers stationed in their states. Many white Southerners disapproved of African American office holders. One Democrat noted, "A white man's government is the most popular rallying cry we have. In 1866, a group of white Southerners in Tennessee created the Ku Klux Klan. This secret society opposed civil rights, particularly suffrage for African Americans. The Klan used violence and terror against African Americans. The group's membership grew rapidly as it spread throughout the South. Klan members wore robes and disguises to hide their identities. They attacked and even murdered African Americans, white Republican voters, and public officials, usually at night. Local governments did little to stop the violence. Many officials feared the Klan or were sympathetic to its activities. In 1870 and 1871, the federal government took action. In an affirmation of federal authority, Congress passed laws called the Enforcement Acts that made it a federal crime to interfere with elections or to deny citizens equal protection under the law. Within a few years, the Klan was no longer an organized threat, but groups of white vigilantes, including the White League in Louisiana and the Red Shirts in Mississippi, North and South Carolina, continued to assault African Americans and Republicans throughout the 1870s. Unlike the Ku Klux Klan, the White League and the Red Shirts operated openly. Reconstruction ends. The violence of the Ku Klux Klan was not the only challenge to Reconstruction. Republicans slowly lost control of Southern state governments to the Democratic Party. The General Amnesty Act of 1872 allowed former Confederates, except those who had held high ranks, to serve in public offices. Many of those former Confederates, most of whom were Democrats, were soon elected to Southern governments. The Republican Party also began losing its power to the North. Although President Grant was re-elected in 1872, financial and political scandals in his administration upset voters. In his first term, a gold buying scheme involving Grant's cousin led to a brief crisis on the stock market called Black Friday. During his second term, his personal secretary was involved in a whiskey ring scandal in which whiskey distillers and public officials worked together to steal liquor taxes from the federal government. Also, people blamed Republican policies for the Panic of 1873. The Panic of 1873. The severe economic downturn began in September 1873 when J. Cook and Company, a major investor in railroads and the largest financer of the Union's Civil War effort, declared bankruptcy. The company had lied about the value of land along the side of the Northern Pacific Railroad that it owned and was trying to sell. When the truth leaked out, the company failed. The failure of such an important business sent panic through the stock market, and investors began selling shares of stocks more rapidly than people wanted to buy them. Soon, 89 of the nation's 364 railroads had failed as well. The failure of almost 18,000 other businesses followed. Within 2 years, by 1876, unemployment had risen to 14%, with an estimated 2 million people out of work. The high unemployment rate set off numerous strikes and protests, many involving railroad workers. In 1874, the Democrats gained control of the House of Representatives. Northerners were becoming less concerned about Southern racism and more concerned about their financial well-being. The election of 1876. Republicans could tell that Northern support for Reconstruction was fading. Voters' attention was shifting to economic problems. In 1876, the Republican Party lost control of the House of Representatives to the Democrats. The Republicans in Congress managed to pass one last civil rights law. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 granted African Americans equal rights in public places, such as theaters and public transportation. But as Americans became increasingly worried about economic problems, the government's corruption, the Republican Party began to abandon Reconstruction. Republicans selected Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes as their 1876 presidential candidate. He believed in ending federal support of the Reconstruction government. The Democrats nominated New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden. During the election, Democrats in the South again used violence at the polls to keep Republican voters away. The election between Hayes and Tilden was close. Tilden appeared to have won. Republicans challenged the electoral votes in Oregon and 3 southern states. A special commission of members of Congress and Supreme Court justices was appointed to settle the issue. The commission narrowly decided to give all the disputed votes to Hayes. Hayes thus won the presidency by 1 electoral vote. In the Compromise of 1877, the Democrats agreed to accept Hayes' victory. In return, they wanted all remaining federal troops removed from the South. They also asked for funding for internal improvements in the South and the appointment of a Southern Democrat to the presidential cabinet. Shortly after he took office in 1877, President Hayes removed the last of the federal troops from the South.